Every freezing morning in Ashford Ridge, a silent veteran walks through the snow with his loyal dog. The town thinks it's cruelty, but they don't see the war inside him, or the one soul keeping him alive. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. Ashford Ridge lay under a pale, frozen dawn, where mist clung to snow-laden pines and the wind whispered through empty streets, carrying a cold so deep it felt like memory itself had turned to ice. Elias Turner walked through that silence as if he belonged to it. Tall but worn thin by years that had taken more than they had given, he moved with a steady, disciplined rhythm that did not belong to ordinary men. His shoulders were slightly hunched, not from weakness, but from the constant, familiar weight of the military rucksack strapped tightly across his back. The canvas bag, faded and weathered, pressed into him like an old companion, filled with sandbags that shifted with every step, forcing his muscles to work, forcing his mind to stay present. Elias welcomed the strain. Pain was simple. Pain was honest. Pain kept the past from flooding in all at once. His face told a quieter story. A strong, angular jaw partially hidden beneath a short, carefully trimmed beard dusted with frost. Lines carved deep around his eyes, not from age alone, but from things he had seen and never spoken of. His hair, once dark, now streaked with grey at the temples, moved slightly in the cold wind. But it was his eyes that held the truth, blue, distant, and watchful, as if they were always searching for something that might never return. There was no anger in them, only a stillness, the kind that comes after storms that never truly end. At his right side walked Coda. The German shepherd was large, nearly 3 years old, his body built with powerful, clean lines that spoke of strength without aggression. His coat was a blend of silver and ash gray, thick against the cold, with darker streaks running along his back like shadows frozen into fur. His golden eyes were alert but calm, constantly scanning their surroundings with a quiet intelligence. There was no leash connecting him to Elias, yet he stayed perfectly aligned at the man's heel, adjusting his pace instinctively, never needing command. His mouth hung slightly open as he breathed, releasing soft clouds of warmth into the freezing air, each exhale steady, controlled, mirroring the man beside him. To anyone watching, it looked like training, precision, control. But to Coda, it was something else entirely. The bond between them was not built on obedience. It was built on survival. As Elias stepped forward, the snow crunched beneath his boots in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Each sound grounded him, pulled him away from the edges of something darker. Still, there were moments, small, dangerous moments, when the wind shifted just right, when the world around him blurred and the present threatened to dissolve. He felt it now, faint but rising, a tightening in his chest, a flicker at the edge of memory. He adjusted the strap of his rucksack, forcing his focus back to the cold, to the weight, to the sound of his own breathing. Coda noticed. The dog's ears twitched subtly, catching the change before Elias himself fully understood it. Without breaking stride, Coda shifted slightly closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Elias's leg, not enough to interrupt, just enough to remind. "I'm here." The gesture was small, almost invisible, but it carried a quiet certainty. Elias's breath steadied. The moment passed. Down the street, a figure stood watching from behind a frost-edged window. Margaret Hale, a woman in her late 60s, thin and slightly stooped from years of working in the Ironwood Cafe, held a steaming mug of coffee in both hands. Her grey hair was tied back loosely, strands escaping around her lined face. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, followed Elias and Coda with a mixture of concern and unease. Margaret had lived in Ashford Ridge her entire life. She knew every face, every story. But Elias Turner, he was different. He had arrived years ago without explanation, settling into a small cabin at the edge of town, keeping mostly to himself. He was polite when spoken to, but distant, untouchable in a way that unsettled people. She watched the way the dog moved, too perfect, too controlled. It didn't feel natural to her. It felt forced. Behind her, a younger man leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Caleb Dunn was in his early 30s, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and a permanent crease between his brows that gave him an air of constant skepticism. He worked maintenance for the town, a practical man who trusted what he could see and measure. He had grown up in Ashford Ridge, and like many others, he did not trust what he did not understand. His gaze followed Elias with a harder edge. "That dog's not right," Caleb muttered, his voice low but firm. "No leash, no wandering, no mistakes. That's not loyalty. That's pressure." Margaret didn't respond immediately. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes still fixed on the pair moving through the snow. "Or maybe," she said quietly, "we just don't know what we're looking at." Outside, Elias and Coda continued their march, unaware or perhaps simply indifferent to the eyes following them. The wind picked up slightly, sending fine snow drifting across their path. Elias leaned into it without hesitation. The cold bit at his skin, but he barely felt it anymore. Cold was simple. Cold didn't lie. As they reached the edge of town, where the road narrowed and the trees grew denser, Elias slowed just enough to adjust his grip on the strap of his rucksack. For a brief moment, his gaze dropped to Coda. The dog looked up at him, their eyes meeting. No words, no commands, just understanding. They moved forward again, step by step, into the quiet, unforgiving white. And behind them, in the warmth of the town, the whispers began. Inside the Ironwood Cafe, warmth gathered like a fragile illusion against the relentless cold outside, the scent of roasted coffee and buttered toast wrapping around the small room, while quiet voices stitched together stories that had never truly been seen. Margaret Hale stood behind the counter, her thin fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug as if it was something steady in a world that often wasn't, her sharp grey eyes flicking occasionally toward the window where Elias and Coda had long since disappeared into the white distance. Yet their presence lingered like a question no one could answer. Around her, the morning regulars leaned closer to one another, their words hushed but heavy, each sentence adding another layer to the version of truth they were building. Caleb Dunn remained near the counter, his broad frame casting a shadow against the wooden floor, his beard slightly damp from melted frost. His gaze fixed not on the window now, but on the reactions of the others, as if measuring agreement more than seeking understanding, his voice low and certain when he spoke again, shaped by years of believing that control was the only way to keep chaos at bay. "Men like that don't just walk it off," he said, his tone firm, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had once watched his own father unravel after losing a logging partner in a winter accident, an event that had carved into Caleb a distrust of silence and what it might be hiding. "That dog isn't choosing anything. It's been trained to obey, that's all." At a corner table, a new voice joined, softer, but carrying an edge of thoughtfulness that made the others pause. Dr. Emily Carter sat with her back straight, despite the long hours she kept at the small clinic on the edge of town, her dark hair pulled into a loose knot, strands falling gently against her pale skin, her eyes observant and steady, in a way that suggested she saw more than most chose to. In her mid-30s, she had arrived in Ashford Ridge 2 years prior, leaving behind a larger city hospital after what some whispered had been burnout, though those who knew her better understood it was something deeper. Too many nights watching people break in ways medicine could not fix. She had learned to recognize pain that wore no visible wounds. Or maybe, Emily said quietly, setting her cup down with deliberate calm, it's not obedience. Maybe it's awareness. Caleb frowned, his brow tightening. You're saying the dog knows what he's doing? I'm saying, Emily replied, her voice still gentle but grounded, animals don't fake that kind of consistency. Not under fear. Fear breaks patterns. What we saw this morning, that wasn't fear. Margaret glanced between them, her lips pressing together, uncertainty flickering across her face as the conversation shifted from judgment to something less certain, something uncomfortable. Around the room, the murmurs changed tone, not quieter, but more divided. Some nodded with Caleb, clinging to the simplicity of control and cause. Others hesitated, drawn to the possibility that what they had seen might not fit into the easy shape of cruelty. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the windows, a low hum threading through the cafe as if the mountain itself were listening. And in that moment, the town sat at a quiet crossroads between assumption and doubt. Emily leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting once more to the frost-lined glass. We don't know his story, she added, almost to herself, but we've already decided how it ends. No one answered, because deep down, each of them knew that was true. The warmth of the cafe no longer felt as comforting as it had before. Something had shifted. Not enough to change minds, not yet, but enough to plant a seed of unease. And as the conversations resumed, they carried a different weight now, less certain, more cautious, as if the truth had begun to move just beneath the surface, waiting. Far beyond the cafe walls, Elias and Coda disappeared deeper into the tree line, their figures swallowed by the snow and silence, unaware that behind them, the story about them was beginning to change, not into understanding, not yet, but into something far more dangerous. Doubt. The morning came harsher than the ones before, the wind sharper, the silence thinner, as if something beneath the frozen surface of Ashford Ridge had begun to stir, waiting for the right moment to rise. Elias Turner walked his usual path along the narrow road that curved past the edge of town, his boots pressing deep into the packed snow, his breath steady but heavy, each step measured against the weight on his back and the weight inside his mind. Coda remained at his side, perfectly aligned, his body calm yet alert, his golden eyes constantly shifting, reading the world in ways no human could fully understand. There was a tension in the air that morning, subtle but present, like the pause before a storm breaks. It came without warning. The roar of an engine tore through the quiet, sudden and violent, echoing off the mountainside with a metallic growl that did not belong to this place. A county snowplow emerged from the bend ahead, its massive blades scraping against the frozen asphalt, sending vibrations through the ground like distant thunder. For most, it was just another sound of winter work. For Elias, it was something else entirely. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. His shoulders stiffened, his breath hitched sharply, and the world around him fractured in an instant. The snow beneath his boots dissolved into dust and smoke. The cold air turned thick and suffocating. The distant hum of the engine twisted into something louder, closer, something alive with memory. Elias stopped. Not slowly, not uncertainly, completely. His body locked in place as if anchored by something unseen. His eyes, once steady, now stared forward without focus, wide and distant, reflecting a world that was no longer there. The past had found him again, not as a memory, but as a reality that refused to stay buried. His fingers curled slightly at his sides, trembling, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming surge of something he could not control. Coda noticed instantly. The dog's posture shifted, subtle but decisive. His ears flattened slightly, his body angling just enough to place himself closer to Elias, his presence tightening like a shield, forming around something fragile. He did not bark. He did not panic. He simply stayed, watching, waiting, ready. From the sidewalk across the road, a man stepped forward. Thomas Grady was in his early 50s, tall with a broad, weathered face and a thick mustache that had long since gone grey. He wore a heavy work jacket dusted with snow, his hands rough from years of repairing engines and machinery at the town's small garage. Thomas was known as a practical man, the kind who fixed problems with his hands rather than his words. But beneath that was a quiet impatience with anything he couldn't understand. He had seen Elias before, had watched him walk past day after day, and like many others, had already formed his own conclusions. Seeing Elias frozen in the middle of the road, Thomas frowned and stepped closer, concern mixing with irritation. "Hey," he called out, his voice firm, cutting through the noise of the approaching plow. "You all right?" There was no response. Elias didn't hear him. Thomas moved closer, boots crunching against the snow, his brow tightening. From his perspective, it looked simple. A man overwhelmed, maybe dizzy, maybe unstable. Something that needed to be snapped out of. He reached out a gloved hand toward Elias's shoulder, intending to shake him back into the present. He never made contact. Coda moved first. In a single fluid motion, the German shepherd stepped forward, placing his body directly between Elias and the approaching man. His stance lowered, not aggressive, but immovable, his muscles tightening beneath his thick coat. A low, deep growl vibrated from his chest, not loud, not wild, but controlled, deliberate, a clear warning drawn in sound instead of teeth. His eyes locked onto Thomas, sharp and unblinking. Thomas froze. The hand he had extended stopped mid-air, his breath catching as instinct replaced intention. He took a step back without realizing it. The crunch of snow beneath his boots suddenly louder than before. The dog didn't advance. It didn't lunge. It simply held its ground, a living barrier, protecting something that could not protect itself. Around them, the world seemed to pause. A car slowed in the distance. Someone watched from a nearby porch. The snowplow continued forward, its engine still roaring, but now it felt far away, distant compared to the tension unfolding in the middle of the road. Thomas lowered his hand slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to unease. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath, taking another cautious step back. To him, and to anyone else watching, it looked exactly like what they had feared. A man out of control. A dog ready to turn dangerous. But they didn't see what was really happening. They didn't see that Elias wasn't standing in front of them, anymore, and they didn't see that Coda wasn't guarding against them. He was guarding against the fall. The moment stretched, fragile and unresolved, as the misunderstanding deepened, taking root in the minds of those who watched. And somewhere behind the fear, a decision was already beginning to form. By late afternoon, the sky over Ashford Ridge had turned a dull iron grey, the kind that pressed low over the town as if it were carrying the weight of something unresolved, and the wind that followed cut sharper than before, sweeping loose snow across the narrow road leading to Elias Turner's cabin at the edge of the pine woods. The quiet isolation that once protected him now felt exposed, as the distant rumble of an approaching vehicle broke the stillness, steady and deliberate, unlike the chaotic noise that had shattered his morning. A sheriff's cruiser came to a slow stop outside the small wooden cabin, its tires crunching over the frozen ground, the engine idling with a low, controlled hum that carried authority more than threat. Elias stood just inside the doorway, his hand gripping the edge of the frame, his posture tense, not from surprise, but from recognition. Encounters like this rarely ended simply. His breathing was uneven, though he tried to steady it, his mind still fragile from the earlier break, the edges of reality not fully settled. Behind him, Coda stood in the shadowed hallway, silent, watching, his body still but ready, his attention fixed entirely on the presence outside. The car doors opened almost in unison. Sheriff Daniel Mercer stepped forward first, a man in his early 50s with a broad, grounded build, his face marked by years of measured decisions and quiet responsibility. His hair was closely cropped, streaked with grey, and his jaw carried the firmness of someone accustomed to being listened to. Yet there was something else in his eyes, a patience shaped not just by law enforcement, but by personal loss. Years ago, his younger brother, a veteran, had struggled with the same invisible battles that now lingered behind Elias's gaze. It had taught Mercer something the badge alone never could, that not all threats looked the same. Beside him walked Officer Rachel Lynn, younger, perhaps in her late 20s, her posture upright, her expression focused but not hardened. She had sharp, observant eyes and a calm presence that balanced Mercer's weight. Her dark hair was pulled tightly into a bun beneath her hat, and her movements were precise, controlled, the result of someone who believed deeply in doing things the right way. She carried no visible judgment, only attention. A third figure followed, slightly behind. Victor Hale, the county animal control officer, was tall and lean, his narrow face partially hidden beneath a thick scarf, his pale eyes calculating, distant. His coat was worn but practical, his gloves thick, gripping the aluminum catchpole with practiced familiarity. Victor had spent years dealing with animals at their worst, abandoned, aggressive, broken, and somewhere along the way, empathy had been replaced with efficiency. To him, animals were problems to be managed, not stories to be understood. The metal loop at the end of his pole swayed slightly as he walked, catching the dim light with a cold, indifferent gleam. Sheriff Mercer approached the porch slowly, his boots heavy but measured against the wooden steps. "Elias," he called, his voice firm but not hostile. "We need to talk." Elias didn't answer immediately. His eyes shifted briefly toward the pole in Victor's hand, and something inside him cracked. The shape of it, the loop, the angle, the cold precision was too familiar. It wasn't the present anymore. It was a corridor of concrete and echoes. It was barking, whining, steel doors, a place where fear lived in every corner. His chest tightened violently. "Don't!" His voice broke before the word could fully form. His grip on the doorframe loosened, his fingers slipping as his body swayed under the sudden weight of memory colliding with reality. "Don't take him back." The words came out fractured, barely more than a whisper, but they carried something deeper than fear. Behind him, Coda moved, not toward the officers, toward Elias. The moment Elias's knees gave way, his body collapsing forward under the combined pressure of his own panic and the heavy rucksack still strapped to his back, Coda was already there. With a low, strained grunt, the dog positioned himself beneath the bag, bracing his strong shoulders against the weight, lifting just enough to keep Elias from being crushed into the frozen boards of the porch. His body trembled slightly with the effort, but he held firm. Then he leaned in closer. His breath, warm and steady, brushed against Elias's face in soft, rhythmic bursts. His tongue flicked gently against the man's cheek, not frantic, not desperate, just present, grounding, calling him back. "I pulled him out," Elias gasped, his hands clutching at Coda's fur as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. Tears froze against his skin as they fell. They were going to put him down. He was on the list. The wind seemed to quiet for a moment. No one spoke. Sheriff Mercer's gaze shifted not to the man, but to the dog. He saw the tension in Coda's muscles, the controlled breathing, the complete absence of aggression. This was not a dog reacting out of fear. This was a dog holding something together. Victor's grip on the catchpole loosened slightly, uncertainty flickering across his otherwise rigid expression. Rachel Lynne's posture softened, her eyes narrowing with quiet realization. "He keeps me here," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible now, his strength fading. "Without him, I'm not—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Coda didn't move. He didn't leave. And in that moment, the truth stood there in the cold, undeniable, waiting to be seen. Morning returned to Ashford Ridge with the same quiet snowfall, but something unseen had shifted, as if the storm had passed not through the sky, but through the hearts of those who had witnessed what they did not understand the day before. The air still carried the cold, sharp, and biting, yet it no longer felt as heavy. It moved differently now, lighter, uncertain, almost hesitant. Elias Turner stepped out from his cabin just as he always did, the worn wooden door creaking softly behind him, his hand lingering on the frame for a brief moment longer than usual, as if grounding himself before stepping into a world that had, for so long, remained distant and unwelcoming. The rucksack was already secured across his back, the familiar weight settling into his shoulders. But today, it felt different, not lighter, but less alone. His posture was still guarded, his movements controlled, yet there was a faint awareness in his eyes, a quiet question he had never allowed himself to ask before. What if something had changed? Coda emerged beside him, his thick grey coat catching the pale light of the morning, each strand dusted with fine snow that melted slowly against his warmth. He moved with the same calm precision, his golden eyes alert, scanning the horizon with quiet vigilance. But his attention returned to Elias more often now, as if checking, confirming, ensuring the man beside him was still present, still anchored. He brushed lightly against Elias's leg as they began their walk, the contact brief but intentional. A silent reassurance passed between them like breath in cold air. As they approached the edge of town, the usual tension Elias carried began to surface, the instinct to avoid, to retreat, to remain unseen. For years, the town had been a place of distance, not danger, but not safety either. But today, something interrupted that expectation. A figure stood on the porch of a small house near the road. Thomas Grady, the same man who had reached out the day before, whose hand had stopped mid-air when Coda stepped in between. He looked different now, not in appearance, but in the way he held himself. His broad shoulders were still squared, his heavy jacket pulled tightly against the cold, but there was no urgency in his stance, no attempt to move forward. Instead, he stood still, his weathered face softened by something unfamiliar reflection. In his hand, he held a worn wool cap, turning it slowly between his fingers, a habit he had carried since his younger years when words failed him more often than they came easily. As Elias and Coda drew closer, Thomas took a slow breath. Then, without rushing, without stepping forward, he removed his cap and held it against his chest. The gesture was simple, almost old-fashioned, but it carried weight, the kind of respect that did not need explanation. "Morning," Thomas said quietly. His voice lacked the edge it once carried. Elias slowed, not stopping completely, but enough to acknowledge the moment. His eyes flicked toward Thomas, cautious, searching, as if trying to understand whether this was real or another trick of a mind that had betrayed him before. Thomas's gaze dropped, not out of avoidance, but in deliberate humility, before shifting gently toward Coda. "Morning, Coda." The words settled into the cold air with a quiet finality. Coda paused for a fraction of a second, his ears lifting slightly, his posture relaxing just enough to signal recognition, not submission, not obedience, but acceptance. He gave a soft exhale, a faint cloud of warmth, escaping into the air, before continuing forward in perfect step beside Elias. Elias said nothing, but something inside him eased. Further down the road, another figure stood outside the Ironwood Cafe. Margaret Hale watched them approach, her usual guarded expression replaced with something more open, more thoughtful. She gave a small nod, not the kind given out of habit, but the kind that acknowledged something deeper than words. Behind her, through the fogged glass, Caleb Dunn stood still, his arms no longer crossed in resistance, his posture less rigid, as if the certainty he once held had been quietly dismantled. He did not step outside. Not yet. But he watched differently now, no longer searching for proof of what he believed, but trying to understand what he had missed. And near the edge of the cafe porch, Dr. Emily Carter leaned lightly against the wooden railing, her calm gaze following Elias and Coda with a quiet sense of recognition. She did not smile, but there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not pity, not sympathy, but respect. The town had not changed overnight. People rarely did. But something had begun. Elias and Coda continued their walk, the snow crunching beneath their feet in the same steady rhythm. The world still cold, still uncertain. Yet this time, the silence that followed them was different. It was no longer filled with judgment. It was filled with understanding. And as they disappeared once more into the white distance, leaving behind two sets of tracks side by side, it became clear they were never meant to walk alone. In the quiet places of this world, miracles rarely arrive with thunder or light. Sometimes they walk beside us, in a loyal heart that refuses to leave, in a soul that stays, even when everything else fades away. Perhaps God does not always send angels with wings. Sometimes he sends them with 4 legs, a warm breath in the cold, and a love that asks for nothing in return. Elias was not saved by strength. He was saved by presence, by a bond so pure. It held him together when he could no longer hold himself. And maybe, in our own lives, we are given the same quiet miracles. A person, a companion, a moment of grace, something or someone placed gently in our path to remind us we are not alone. So if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment and let others know what stayed with you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us of faith, love, and the unseen ways we are carried. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps, even on the coldest roads, even in the darkest moments, until you find your way back to the light.